In the spring of 1834, somewhere among the rolling hills of central Virginia, a discovery was made that would permanently alter how we understand the depths of human cruelty. 47 children, ranging in age from 6 to 16, were found chained inside a basement beneath what appeared to be an ordinary farmhouse. The children shared no physical resemblance, spoke different languages, and when questioned, could only whisper a single name through their tears: Mother Sullivan. The local sheriff's report, hidden away for more than a century in the Henry County archives, described scenes so disturbing that 3 investigating officers resigned within a single week. What makes this case especially haunting is not only the horror of what was uncovered, but the chilling realization that Constance Sullivan had been running her twisted operation for over 20 years without discovery. The children called her mother, yet the truth behind that title proved far darker than anyone could have imagined. Before continuing with the story of the Sullivan family and their unspeakable secrets, I want to ask you something important. This channel is not meant for everyone. It exists for the bravest souls, those willing to confront the darkest chapters of American history. If you've made it this far, you are not like most people. You understand that some truths are too horrifying to ignore, no matter how deeply they unsettle us. So hit that subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you brave enough to hear stories like this from your own backyard? The question that haunted investigators then and continues to confuse historians today is how such a massive operation could remain hidden for so long in a close-knit rural community. Virginia in 1834 was a land caught between 2 eras. The old plantation system still shaped daily life, while faint whispers of industrial change drifted down from the north. Within this environment, the small farming community of Millbrook, a cluster of perhaps 50 families scattered across the gentle slopes of Henry County, represented a typical rural American settlement of the time. Most residents farmed tobacco or corn, traded goods at Henderson's general store, and gathered for social events at the one-room schoolhouse that also served as a community meeting hall. The Sullivan property lay on the outskirts of this settlement, a modest 2-story wooden farmhouse surrounded by nearly 200 acres of valuable farmland. To any traveler moving along the dusty road connecting Millbrook to Richmond, the Sullivan farm looked completely unremarkable. The house itself, built in the Federal style popular during the 1810s, featured white-painted clapboard siding and a wraparound porch typical of Virginia architecture. A red barn stood 60 yards behind the house, with a chicken coop and smokehouse completing the familiar farmstead layout. What made the Sullivan property unusual was not visible from the road. Ezra Sullivan, who purchased the land in 1809 using money inherited from his father's tobacco fortune, devoted significant effort to expanding the home's basement. While most Virginia houses of the period had simple root cellars, the Sullivan basement extended far beyond the footprint of the house above. Local craftsmen later recalled being hired for various excavation projects throughout the 1810s and 1820s, though none ever saw the finished structure. Ezra paid generously and always in cash, asking only that workers focus on their assigned sections rather than the project as a whole. Constance Sullivan, Ezra's wife, arrived in Millbrook in 1811 as a 22-year-old bride. Neighbors remembered her as an attractive woman with dark hair and an unusually gentle voice. She dressed plainly but neatly, attended Methodist church services when her health allowed, and maintained a reputation for charitable deeds. When approached about contributing to community causes, Constance would explain that she and Ezra were already caring for several orphaned children from her family back in Pennsylvania. The arrangement, she said, was temporary, only until permanent homes could be arranged. This explanation satisfied curiosity about the occasional glimpses of children around the Sullivan property. Mrs. Henderson at the general store sometimes noticed a young face peering from the Sullivan wagon when Constance came to town for supplies. The children never spoke, but Constance would explain that they were shy, traumatized by the loss of their parents, and needed time to adjust. The community, familiar with the tragedy of orphan children in an era of high mortality, accepted these explanations without hesitation. Thomas Henderson, who ran the general store, later recalled that Constance Sullivan was one of his most dependable customers. Every 2 weeks she arrived with a detailed list and enough cash to purchase large quantities of basic food supplies such as flour, cornmeal, salt, pork, molasses, and other staples. The quantities seemed excessive for a childless couple, but when Thomas mentioned it, Constance reminded him about the orphaned children. She also purchased unusually large amounts of basic medicines, explaining that children from difficult circumstances often arrived with various illnesses that required treatment. The Sullivan farm followed a schedule that puzzled some neighbors. While most farming families rose with the sun and worked until dusk, activity at the Sullivan property often continued late into the night. Lights appeared in the farmhouse windows at odd hours, and the sound of hammering or construction sometimes echoed across the fields after dark. When questioned, Ezra explained that he was making improvements to accommodate the growing number of children in their care. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling physician who served the Millbrook area, remembered being summoned to the Sullivan farm several times during the 1820s and early 1830s. Each time, he was told that one of the orphaned children had fallen ill and needed medical attention. However, he was never allowed to examine the children directly. Instead, Constance described the symptoms and requested specific medicines. When the doctor insisted on seeing his patients, Constance explained that the children were terrified of strangers, too traumatized to allow examinations by unfamiliar men. The deception was so thorough that even the local pastor, Reverend Samuel Matthews, believed in the Sullivan family's charitable work. During his occasional visits, he praised Constance and Ezra for their Christian compassion in caring for so many unfortunate children. He offered to help find permanent homes for the orphans, but Constance always claimed she was corresponding with relatives in Pennsylvania who would eventually take them. The process, she assured him, simply required patience and careful planning. What no one realized was that Constance Sullivan had been perfecting her deception for more than 2 decades. The orphaned children were not temporary guests waiting for loving families. They were prisoners, purchased, kidnapped, or lured from their homes across multiple states, held in conditions that would have made hardened criminals recoil in horror. The discovery that finally exposed the Sullivan family's secrets began with a series of seemingly unrelated events in early 1834. February had been unusually brutal, with temperatures dropping well below freezing for weeks. The bitter cold that gripped Virginia that winter proved both a curse and a blessing for the 47 children trapped beneath the Sullivan farmhouse. On February 23, 1834, a traveling merchant named Jacob Stern was making his way from Richmond to Charlottesville when a violent snowstorm forced him to seek shelter. The Sullivan farm, being the nearest visible building, seemed the obvious choice. Ezra Sullivan, despite his clear reluctance, could not refuse hospitality to a stranded traveler during such dangerous conditions. Stern later described the evening as deeply uncomfortable. Constance Sullivan served a simple meal of cornbread and salt pork, but conversation felt strained and awkward. The Sullivans appeared nervous, exchanging glances and reacting sharply to every sound. When Stern asked about the children he had heard lived on the farm, Constance explained that they were all asleep and should not be disturbed. She said the children had been ill with fever and needed rest. What disturbed Stern most was the sound. Throughout the night, as he lay on a makeshift bed in the parlor, he heard what sounded like muffled crying coming from beneath the floor. When he mentioned it to Ezra the next morning, Sullivan claimed it was simply the wind moving through gaps in the foundation, a common sound in old houses during cold weather. Stern accepted the explanation, but something about the Sullivans' behavior stayed with him. The second incident occurred 3 weeks later, on March 15th. Mary Catherine Flynn, a young Irish immigrant traveling with her family to find work in the tobacco fields near Richmond, became separated during a river crossing. Exhausted and frightened, she made her way to the Sullivan farm. As night fell, Constance Sullivan took her in, offering food and shelter. Mary Catherine was never seen alive again. When her family reported her missing to the Richmond sheriff, they described her last known location and direction of travel. A search party was organized, but the vast Virginia wilderness made finding a single missing person nearly impossible. After a week, the search was called off, and Mary Catherine Flynn was presumed to have died from exposure or been killed by wild animals. The final incident occurred on April 2nd, 1834. A local farmer named William Hutchinson was hunting rabbits near the woods bordering the Sullivan property when he heard something that stopped him cold. From somewhere near the farmhouse came the sound of children screaming. These were not playful cries, but raw, desperate shrieks of terror. Hutchinson moved closer, hiding behind a stand of oak trees about 50 yards from the house. For nearly an hour he watched and listened. The screams continued intermittently, always seeming to come from beneath the house. At one point, he saw Ezra Sullivan emerge from what appeared to be a cellar door along the side of the house. Sullivan looked around nervously, then disappeared back underground. When Hutchinson reported what he had seen, opinions were divided. Some suggested the orphan children might be more troubled than the Sullivans had admitted, perhaps requiring discipline or treatment that sounded distressing. Others began to recall odd details that had once seemed insignificant: the large food purchases, the strange nighttime noises, and the fact that none of the orphans were ever seen in town. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, a veteran lawman with over 15 years of service in Henrico County, initially dismissed the concerns as gossip. But when Hutchinson insisted on filing a formal complaint, Crawford agreed to investigate. The law required him to follow up on reports of possible child abuse regardless of personal opinion. On the morning of April 8, 1834, Sheriff Crawford rode to the Sullivan farm with his deputy, Marcus Webb. They arrived just after sunrise, expecting a routine visit that would quiet the rumors. Constance Sullivan greeted them calmly and invited them inside for coffee, expressing concern over the talk spreading through the community. Everything seemed ordinary until Deputy Webb asked to use the privy. As he walked around the house, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The cellar door Hutchinson described was secured with 3 heavy padlocks. Thick chains wrapped around the handles, and the wood surrounding the lock showed signs of frantic clawing, as if someone had tried desperately to escape from inside. When Webb quietly informed Sheriff Crawford, both men understood they were facing something far more serious than gossip. Crawford politely asked Constance to show them the cellar, saying a thorough inspection would put the rumors to rest. Her demeanor changed instantly. Her face drained of color, her hands trembled, and she stammered that the cellar was dangerous, that the children were not allowed there, and that it held nothing but old equipment. Then they heard it. From beneath their feet came the sound of children crying, followed by a weak voice begging for help. The sound was unmistakable and came directly from below the kitchen. The aftermath of that discovery haunted Sheriff Crawford for the rest of his life. When the cellar door was forced open, the stench that rose from below was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something Crawford later described as the smell of despair itself. The basement Ezra Sullivan spent decades constructing was a monument to calculated cruelty. It stretched far beyond the house, extending underground like a warren. Stone walls carefully mortared to muffle sound formed a series of connected rooms. The largest chamber housed most of the children. They were chained to iron rings set into the walls, shackles locked around their ankles. The chains allowed minimal movement but no escape. The children, aged 6 to 16, were emaciated and dressed in rags, their bodies marked by neglect and abuse. Many suffered from illness, fever, breathing problems, and skin infections caused by damp, unventilated conditions. What struck the officers most was the silence. After the first cries, the children said nothing, staring with eyes that held no hope or expectation of rescue. Deputy Webb, a father of 4, had to leave twice to vomit. Sheriff Crawford struggled to comprehend the scale of what he was seeing. In smaller rooms, they found evidence of the Sullivan control system. One room held stocks and restraints for punishment. Another appeared to be a crude medical area where children were treated not out of care, but to keep them alive. A third contained detailed records that proved crucial: names, ages, arrival dates, and notes on behavior. The records revealed children had been arriving since 1812. Over 90 children had passed through the basement. The question of what happened to the others was answered in a separate chamber, reached through a narrow crawl space. There, they found the remains of at least 36 children, buried beneath the floor and covered with lime. The investigation that followed stretched for months, revealing a criminal enterprise built on deception, psychological control, and calculated cruelty, one that had remained hidden for more than 20 years. The legal consequences were complicated by the reality that many of the crimes had taken place across different jurisdictions, each governed by separate laws. As the weeks passed, more survivors slowly began to share their stories. Their accounts were strikingly consistent, describing years of captivity, systematic abuse, and relentless psychological conditioning. The children explained how new arrivals were deliberately broken down, placed in isolation, subjected to punishment, and indoctrinated until they accepted their imprisonment as unavoidable. They spoke of an internal hierarchy enforced among the prisoners, where older children were granted small privileges in exchange for helping control the younger ones. The survivors also revealed the full extent of Constance Sullivan's psychological manipulation. She convinced many of the children that they were worthless, that their families had sold or abandoned them, and that they deserved the suffering inflicted upon them. Some of the older children, who had endured captivity for many years, initially resisted rescue efforts because they had been conditioned to believe that the outside world was even more dangerous than the basement they knew. The investigation uncovered clear evidence of Sullivan's methods for acquiring victims. She had built relationships with corrupt officials at poorhouses and orphanages who supplied children in exchange for money. She also cultivated contacts among criminal circles in major cities who identified vulnerable children, runaways, street orphans, and others whose disappearance would not immediately raise alarms. Most chilling of all, the record showed that the Sullivan operation had been expanding in recent years. The number of children being held had increased, and correspondence revealed plans to establish similar facilities elsewhere. The discovery at the Sullivan farm had interrupted a criminal enterprise that was on the verge of becoming far larger. The breakthrough that led to the complete exposure of the Sullivan network came from an unexpected source. Among the surviving children was a girl named Rebecca, about 14 years old, who had been held longer than any of the others. Unlike many who had been broken by their ordeal, Rebecca retained a spark of defiance and an extraordinary memory for detail. She had been kidnapped from her family's farm in Pennsylvania in 1829 when she was only 9. She remembered everything about her abduction, how a woman claiming to be a distant relative arrived at the farm, how she was lured away with promises of sweets and a ride to town, and how she awoke chained in the Sullivan basement. More importantly, Rebecca remembered every conversation she had overheard between Constance Sullivan and the various visitors who came to the farm over the years. Her testimony revealed that the Sullivan operation was only one part of a much larger network. She recalled hearing discussions about other farms and other locations where children were being held. She remembered names, dates, and details about shipments of children being moved between facilities. Her information gave law enforcement their first comprehensive picture of the true scope of the enterprise. The most significant revelation came when Rebecca described a visit that occurred just 2 weeks before the discovery. A well-dressed man arrived at the farm in an expensive carriage, accompanied by 2 others. Rebecca and 3 additional children were selected to be inspected by the visitors. The man examined them carefully, checking their teeth, muscle tone, and overall health like livestock being evaluated for purchase. He ultimately declined to buy any of the children, complaining they were too damaged for his needs. However, he left behind a letter detailing the specifications for the type of children he wanted. That letter, later found among Sullivan's papers, outlined requirements for children of specific ages, physical traits, and temperaments. The language was cold and transactional, discussing human beings as commodities. It was signed H. Blackwood and included a return address in Charleston, South Carolina. When authorities investigated, they discovered that Henry Blackwood was a wealthy plantation owner who had been acquiring children for years, officially as household servants, but for purposes far more sinister than even the Sullivan operation. The Blackwood connection opened an entirely new dimension of the case. Southern plantation owners, it appeared, had been using the trafficking network to obtain workers who were completely under their control. Unlike enslaved people, who at least had some legal recognition and whose disappearance might be noticed, trafficked children could be worked to death with no legal consequences. They had no families searching for them, no legal status, and no hope of escape. Further investigation revealed that several other prominent Southern families were involved in similar purchases. The children were used not only as laborers, but also as subjects for medical experiments, as targets for violent entertainment, and for purposes investigators found too disturbing to fully document. As the scope of the network became clear, resistance from powerful interests intensified. Many families implicated in the purchases had deep political connections and substantial resources. Threats were made against investigators, witnesses, and even the surviving children. Sheriff Crawford received anonymous letters warning him to abandon the case. Deputy Webb was attacked by unknown assailants while walking home. Dr. Whitfield found his medical practice suddenly boycotted by influential patients. The intimidation escalated when one of the surviving children, a boy named Timothy who had been providing key testimony, vanished from the temporary shelter where he was housed. A search was conducted, but Timothy was never found. The message was unmistakable. Cooperation would be punished. Despite the danger, the investigation pressed on. Federal marshals provided additional protection for witnesses and investigators. The surviving children were relocated to secure locations, and armed guards were posted at the Sullivan farm to protect evidence. The case became a test of whether the American legal system could function when crimes involved wealthy and powerful perpetrators. The pressure reached its peak when Constance Sullivan was found dead in her jail cell. Her death was officially ruled a suicide, but the circumstances were suspicious. She had been scheduled to testify about the full extent of the network, including the names of her contacts and buyers. Her death removed the investigation's most important witness. The shockwaves were immediate. If powerful interests were willing to eliminate key witnesses, no one involved was safe. Just as the investigation seemed in danger of collapse, an unexpected development changed everything. A former employee of Henry Blackwood, driven by guilt, came forward with evidence that shattered the remaining secrecy. His name was Samuel Pierce, an overseer on the Blackwood plantation with first-hand knowledge of the trafficked children. Pierce brought documents proving the link between the Sullivan operation and Southern buyers. More importantly, he had witnessed the fate of many children sold through the network. Pierce's testimony before the federal grand jury in Richmond became one of the most disturbing accounts in American legal history. A man in his 40s with weathered hands and haunted eyes, Pierce had worked for Blackwood for over a decade. He described how the plantation operated 2 separate systems. The main plantation used enslaved labor for cotton production. The second, which Pierce called the experimental quarters, housed trafficked children for purposes unrelated to agriculture. Children purchased from the Sullivan network were used as subjects for medical experiments conducted by Blackwood and several associates, including 2 physicians from Charleston Medical College. These experiments tested the limits of human endurance, studied the effects of drugs and diseases, and satisfied the curiosity of men who viewed children as laboratory animals. Pierce described meticulous records documenting reactions, survival rates, and the progression of deliberately introduced illnesses. The testimony revealed systematic torture disguised as scientific research. At least 37 children from the Sullivan network had been sold to Blackwood. Only 4 survived long enough to be transferred elsewhere. The rest died from experiments, malnutrition, or brutal conditions, and were buried in unmarked graves. Pierce also described meetings where Blackwood discussed purchases with other plantation owners, businessmen, and politicians, revealing a network far larger than imagined. One of the most horrifying revelations involved a gathering in the fall of 1833, hosted by Blackwood as a demonstration for potential buyers. Children were displayed, tested, punished, and examined so buyers could place orders. The atmosphere, Pierce said, resembled a livestock auction. Several grand jurors reportedly left the room during his testimony. The financial scope of the network was staggering. Prices varied by age, condition, and intended use. Younger children commanded higher prices. Those with specific traits were sold at premiums. The total value of the network reached hundreds of thousands of dollars. Using Pierce's information, authorities coordinated raids across the South. Over 100 additional children were rescued. Evidence seized documented decades of trafficking. Henry Blackwood, 2 physicians, and a state legislator were arrested. The records detailed medical atrocities, deliberate infections, poison testing, and surgeries without anesthesia. Corruption was exposed at every level. Officials were bribed, judges were paid off, and law enforcement was compromised. Legal proceedings dragged on for years. Some perpetrators escaped justice through influence or technicalities, but public exposure led to sweeping reforms. The Sullivan case became a catalyst for the first federal child trafficking laws and major reforms in orphanage oversight. The surviving children faced lifelong recovery, many never fully healed. Rebecca, whose testimony changed history, lived quietly with a Quaker family and never spoke publicly again. Ezra Sullivan was convicted and executed in 1836. Henry Blackwood died in prison. The Sullivan farm was demolished, the basement sealed, and a small memorial established. New child protection laws followed nationwide. The case reshaped law enforcement, medical ethics, and public awareness. The greatest lesson of the Sullivan case was not found in courtrooms, but in the courage of ordinary people who refused to ignore warning signs. Their actions exposed one of the darkest criminal enterprises in American history and ensured it could never operate in silence again, sealed away for more than a century. Yet the echoes of their suffering still remind us why vigilance, courage, and compassion are essential when it comes to protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The Sullivan case stands as both a testament to the depths of human evil and a powerful reminder of how individual conscience can challenge and overcome even the most deeply entrenched systems of exploitation and abuse. If this story has sent chills down your spine, then you understand why these dark chapters of American history must never be forgotten. Just when we think we have seen the worst humanity has to offer, horrors like those uncovered at the Sullivan farm force us to confront how evil can hide behind respectable facades and familiar faces. If this story unsettled you, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Tap the like button to support our work, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Together, let's uncover what other secrets remain buried in America's past. This mystery reminds us that evil often wears the mask of normalcy, and that some of the most horrific crimes are committed by people who appear ordinary and trustworthy within their communities. What do you think about this story? Do you believe everything was truly uncovered, or are there still secrets hidden deep within the Virginia hills? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale and want to hear more stories like it, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share this with someone who loves mysteries and dark history. The shadows of American history hold many more secrets, and we'll be here to bring them into the light. See you in the next video. The story does not truly end with the sealing of the Sullivan basement or the final court verdicts. What followed in the years after the trials revealed just how deeply the damage had spread and how long its shadow would linger. Even as laws were rewritten and institutions reformed, the emotional and psychological aftermath for survivors and communities proved far harder to repair. Many of the rescued children struggled to adapt to freedom. Simple choices overwhelmed them. Sleeping in a bed without chains felt unnatural. Silence felt threatening. Some woke screaming from nightmares for decades. Caretakers recorded how children would hide food under mattresses, flinch at raised voices, and panic when doors were closed. Freedom for many felt like another unfamiliar prison. Communities across Virginia and neighboring states began to uncover their own buried secrets. Parents revisited old disappearances that had once been explained away as accidents or runaways. Families returned to orphanage records only to find missing pages and falsified signatures. In several counties, investigations quietly reopened, though many were never made public due to the involvement of influential families. Churches that had once praised charitable households were forced to confront their own failures. Sermons shifted in tone. Blind trust was replaced with cautious responsibility. The belief that kindness always wore a gentle face was permanently shattered. The phrase "trust but verify" quietly entered public conversation long before it was ever formally written. Law enforcement also changed in subtle but lasting ways. Sheriff Crawford's reports emphasized behavioral patterns rather than appearances. He warned future officers that evil rarely announces itself with violence at first. It blends in, it earns trust, it hides behind routine and respectability. His writings later influenced early criminal profiling methods, decades before the term existed. The Sullivan case also reshaped how Americans understood trauma. Physicians began documenting psychological wounds alongside physical ones. Terms like nervous collapse and moral injury entered medical discussion. While primitive by modern standards, these early attempts laid groundwork for trauma psychology. The sealed basement itself became a place people avoided even mentioning. Travelers reported an unnatural stillness around the land. Locals claimed animals refused to graze near the former foundation. Whether superstition or guilt, the site carried a weight that no demolition could erase. Years later, workers laying a road near the property reportedly uncovered a single iron shackle buried deeper than expected, far beyond the filled basement. The chain was quietly removed and melted down. Officials insisted it was unrelated. Few believed them. As generations passed, the story faded from textbooks, but survived in whispers. Parents warned children about strangers who promised help. Communities taught vigilance disguised as folklore. The Sullivan name became shorthand for hidden evil, spoken softly and rarely written. Historians still debate how much of the network was truly destroyed. Some correspondents referenced locations never identified. Some names vanished before arrests could be made. Money trails ended abruptly. There were always hints that fragments survived, reshaped, relocated, or buried under new identities. What remains undeniable is the lesson carved into American history. Evil does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives with a smile, a reputation, and a story everyone wants to believe. The Sullivan case forces us to confront that truth, not to breed fear, but to demand accountability. And perhaps that is why this story still matters, because vigilance is not paranoia, compassion is not blindness, and silence, when something feels wrong, can be the most dangerous accomplice of all. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. In the end, the true moral of this story is not only about the evil that was uncovered, but about the silence that allowed it to survive for so long. the greatest harm was not committed in darkness alone, but in the moments when warning signs were ignored, questions went unasked, and responsibility was quietly passed to someone else. Evil flourishes most easily where people choose comfort over courage. This story reminds us that appearances are never guarantees of goodness. Respectability can be a disguise, authority can be abused, and cruelty often hides behind routines that seem ordinary. That is why vigilance matters, not suspicion without reason, but awareness without denial. Compassion must be paired with accountability, or it becomes another doorway for harm. The Sullivan case teaches us that one voice, one act of conscience can break even the strongest system of abuse. It was not power that ended it, but people who refused to look away. And that is the responsibility carried by every generation, to question, to protect, and to speak when something feels wrong. Because history shows us a hard truth. When we fail to protect the vulnerable, we become part of the system that harms them. And when we choose to act, even at personal cost, we prove that darkness can be confronted, exposed, and stopped. The lesson is simple but unforgiving. Evil does not need permission to exist. It only needs silence.